Do me a favor, take out a dollar bill. You got a chance. Now, it doesn't have to be a dollar. If you got a five, you got a 10, more power to you. But if you just take out some paper money and take a close look at it, examine it, fold it, crinkle it, do whatever you want. And you tell me what it is. Now, of course, when you take a look at that, you'll see that uh, basically it's paper. Now, of course, that's not really accurate. It's more of a cloth than it is a paper, but be that as it may. But it's something that we hunger for. It's something that if you have a lot of it, it can provide you with sometimes untold joy and a certain amount of security. And if you don't have it, you're constantly trying to get it. Do you ever ask yourself the question, why? What really does it do? And why is it worth something? I mean, a piece of loose leaf is paper. It's bigger. You can write on it. You can fold it up just like a dollar bill. You can take it anywhere. So why isn't that worth more? And of course, the question comes down to very simply because the government said so. And if the government says it is, then in our case, we accept it. Now, let's fast forward. Let's take your paycheck. You get a paycheck. Let's, for argument's sake, say you've made $400 this week. You take it to the bank. Now, what do you do with it? Do you get 400 $1 bills? No. Basically, you're either going to put most of it or all of it in your checking account or perhaps your savings account. Now, what do? They have a little box that has Hannah's name on it, and you put 400 $1 bills in there. Somebody, just as I am or you are, sitting at a computer, typing away, that now says that you have $400. Now, do you? Does a computer keystroke really give you that money? And what would happen if everybody in the country went to their banks and demanded their money back right now? They want it in cold, hard cash. What would happen? Because let's face it, that money is not there. You trust that it is. So think about it. The common denominator there between the dollar bill and the government and the bank and your accounts is trust. And when one loses that trust, you face a problem. And in this case, we're talking about the Great Depression, starting in 1929 and going up to perhaps the beginning of World War II. So we're going to take a look at the causes, the effects, and eventually some of the solutions proposed to ending the Great Depression.
Everything I had is gone. Stormy weather. Since my man and I together. Keeps raining all the time.
Now, we talked about this before when we talked about the Roaring Twenties. And in this particular case, the optimism, the let the good times roll aspects of the Roaring Twenties disappeared, it seemed to some people, immediately with a snap of the finger. It's like Thanos from the Avengers came and snapped his fingers and poof, it was all gone. Now, why? How did this happen? Well, let's take a look at the election of 1928. In this particular election, the Republicans, who had dominated the decade of the 20s, ran Herbert Hoover, who many people said sucked, not because he invented the vacuum cleaner, which he did not. His opponent was Al Smith. And as I mentioned to you previously, Al Smith is the first Catholic ever to run for the presidency, and as such, faced a great deal of opposition. There were many people who believed, and I had mentioned this previously, that the Pope and Al Smith were digging a connecting tunnel underneath the Atlantic Ocean so that they could communicate much more easily. And secretly, the Pope would be running the country. Well, as you see, Al Smith only takes maybe 6 states, and Hoover takes all of the rest. So it's an overwhelming victory for the man. Inaugurated on March 4th, 1929, and at the time he was considered to be the most popular president that had come along in a long, long time. And then just 8 months later, people would be cursing his name, using it in derisive terms. Hoovervilles would be used to describe the pop-up homeless centers that dotted almost every major city on its outskirts. Hoover blankets were newspapers that were pulled over you to act as a cover from the elements as you slept outside on park benches or in doorways or on city sidewalks. Now,
I tell you, I don't get no respect at all.
The prosperity of the 20s was not universally shared. Agriculture was going to go into its version of the Depression by the mid-1920s. The coal industry had some major strikes, which depressed that industry. And textiles, clothing industry was depressed as all of a sudden they started facing competition, sounds familiar, from overseas. So the optimism of the 20s was not well founded and not well rooted.
Bring out today!
These shanty towns popped up all over the place. But one of the factors that helped get this depression ball rolling was the debts owed to America after World War I. Remember, even prior to entering the war, we had extended a line of credit to the Allies. And then when we entered the war, we increased that line of credit. Well, now it's time for payback. But this was a ticking time bomb. Take a close look. What was happening was Germany, if you remember, due to the Treaty of Versailles, was stuck with paying back billions to the Allies. The Allies, in turn, were going to take those billions and pay back their debts to the United States. But what was really happening was American investors were loaning money to Germany, who in turn were paying back Great Britain and France, who in turn were taking that American money that Germany had and giving it back to the United States. So it was going in full circle. It was literally a house of cards. And when this became obvious, the whole thing was going to collapse. So this was not going to be just an American depression. This was going to be worldwide. Now, the iconic
I appreciate
area,
the opportunity you're giving me, Mr. Cromwell, as the single largest shareholder in Teldar paper to speak. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're not here to indulge in fantasy, but in political and economic reality. America has become a second-rate power. Its trade deficit and its fiscal deficit are at nightmare proportions. Now, in the days of the free market, when our country was a top industrial power, there was accountability to the stockholder. The Carnegies, the Mellons, the men that built this great industrial empire made sure of it because it was their money at stake. Today, management has no stake in the company. Altogether, these men sitting up here own less than 3% of the company. And where does Mr. Cromwell put his $1 million salary? Not in Teldar stock. He owns less than 1%. You own the company. That's right. You, the stockholder, and you are all being royally screwed over by these bureaucrats with their steak lunches, their hunting and fishing trips, their corporate jets and golden parachutes.
This is an outrage. You're out of line, Gecko.
Teldar Paper, Mr. Cromwell, Teldar Paper has 33 different vice presidents, each earning over $200,000 a year. Now, I have spent the last 2 months analyzing what all these guys do, and I still can't figure it out. One thing I do know is that our paper company lost $110 million last year, and I'll bet that half of that was spent in all the paperwork going back and forth between all these vice presidents. The new law of evolution in corporate America seems to be survival of the unfittest. Well, in my book, you either do it right or you get eliminated. In the last 7 deals that I've been involved with, there were 2.5 million stockholders who have made a pre-tax profit of $12 billion. Thank you. I am not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
Greed is good. And greed was an epidemic during the Roaring '20s. That little speech, of course, coming from the movie Wall Street, which was a big hit in the 1980s when, once again, Wall Street was the center of attention. Take a look at how shaky Wall Street really was in the 1920s. Look at a share of RCA. In 1 year, it went from $85 a share to $420 a share. So if you bought in at 85, you were getting rich very quickly. But look, should it have gone up that much? They actually paid no dividends. Why? Because they didn't make a profit. So how all of a sudden did that price go sky high? It went up 530%. Why? Because people kept buying it, expecting it to go up and up. This escalator knew no top floor, and everybody felt that it was going to continue to go up and up. It was a speculator's market. Somebody who buys low and just immediately expects it to go high. It was, stock analysts say, a bull market. So much so that a number of people started doing something that prior to that was unheard of. That's called buying on margin. Meaning, and I'll just give you an example. Let's say stock is selling at $10 a share. Well, you don't have that kind of money. So you put down $1. You put down 10%. And the rest of the money you borrow in order to buy your stock. You get it from something called a call money market. A call money market. Obviously, in borrowing it, you are expected to pay it back with interest. So what you do is you borrow money, put a little bit of your own money in, you buy the stock, you hold it for a very, very short period of time. In some cases, they held it for just hours, then resold it, made a profit, paid back the money that they borrowed with interest, so everybody goes home happy. It was a gravy train that was just not going to stop. At least that's how it appeared. Standard Oil, if you take a look at the example I put there, was putting in $69 million a day into the call money market. So there was no lack of funds for speculators to borrow to play the market. Evaluator.
And then you had, from beginning the mid-20s on, an accelerating wave of speculation, which then became self-perpetuating. The market was going up, and the expectation that it would go up more caused it to go up more. But then comes the day when those something changes those expectations, and everybody wants to get out. And that is not a matter of weeks or months. That's a matter then of days. The crash comes very fast.
Wall Street lays an egg. So if everybody wants to get out, who do you sell it to? And if you can't sell it, how are you going to pay back the money that you borrowed? And if you can't pay back the money that you borrowed, what happens to those big companies that had all that money tied up? Well, again, the dominoes are going to start to fall.
In October 1929, the nation and the world were stunned as the stock market crash brought a swift and shattering end to an era of exuberant prosperity. $30 billion in paper money vanished into thin air.
Think about it. It vanished. Where was it? Well, again, it was never really there. We trusted, there's that word again, we trusted that it was there. And when it disappeared, that trust went. Black Thursday. Now, keep this in mind. Back in those days, there was no such thing as Social Security. Basically, there really was no company retirement plans for the most part. So what a lot of people, and we're talking about this shoe shine person, we're talking about the paper boy, we're talking about the postal worker, they were playing the stock market. They were taking their money and putting it in because it seemed like the right thing to do. But on October 24th, 1929, when everything went, you had this panic selling. And then all of a sudden, thousands of people went to the House of Morgan, which was down the street from the stock market, hoping that the big bankers would shore everything up. And they did. On that Friday, they bought stock. And everybody breathed a sigh of relief, thinking, well, things are going to be okay. But over the weekend, silently, they began selling off that stock, knowing that everything was about to collapse.
All through the summer of 1929, there had been ominous rumblings. For months, unemployment had been rising. Automobile sales and department store revenues had fallen off sharply. Across the South and West, farms were failing in record numbers. And still on Wall Street, the delirious optimism continued, undimmed. On August 27, 1929, the Dow Jones average reached its all-time peak as an army of frenzied buyers descended on New York. Desperate not to miss a single day's trading, swamping the hotels, camping out on the street in front of the stock exchange, and in the tiny graveyard of Trinity Church on Broadway, where Alexander Hamilton lay buried.
What caused the crash of 29 was excess speculation. What had happened was that the American economy as a whole had begun to cool starting in 1928. And the Wall Street economy disconnected from the underlying real economy and became a speculative bubble. And this fueled the speculation that just took off and took off and took off until, again, one day, somebody woke up and said, this has gone too far. There's an old story about Bernard Baruch, that he had his shoes shined every morning by the same shoe shine boy. And one morning, the shoe shine boy gave him a stock tip. And Baruch went to his office, called up his broker, and said, sell me out. And the shoe shine boys are giving stock tips. It's time to get out.
As summer turned to fall, the mood changed. As the stock market dipped, then rose, then lurched downwards again, investors grew increasingly uneasy. In September, an economist named Roger Babson sent a wave of fear rippling through Wall Street when he warned that sooner or later, a crash is coming, and it may be terrific. But most experts brushed away any concerns. Stock prices, one man declared, have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. And then the bottom fell out. On Wednesday, October 23rd, 1929, the first waves of panicky selling began to drive down the price of blue-chip stocks, like Westinghouse and General Electric. The following morning, the fear turned to panic, and brokers began unloading margin accounts at record speed. Stock prices plummeted sickeningly across the board, spurring the rush of sell orders from terrified speculators still more. As anguished shrieks rose up from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the visitors' gallery was cleared. In less than 2 hours, nearly $10 billion invested in stocks was simply wiped out. Outside on the street, crowds massed 6 deep in front of the stock exchange, while hundreds more stood in shocked silence on the steps of Federal Hall. Newspapers would later try to describe the uncanny murmuring sound that echoed off the stone facades of the financial district that morning. It was a collective moan of horror and grief and stunned disbelief, rising up from thousands of ruined, frightened men. The biggest crowds gathered outside the House of Morgan, desperately hoping for a miracle. Cheers broke out when word came that a consortium of bankers had agreed to pump hundreds of millions of dollars into the stock exchange to shore up the faltering market. Word spread that once again, the day had been saved by the House of Morgan. But the day had not been saved. On Friday, with the market apparently stabilized, the banks withdrew their funds. The following Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, known forever after as Black Tuesday, another tidal wave of selling hit the exchange, and this time, no one came to the rescue.
Nothing could stop it. Just people wanted out. And this was in the fall. Most crashes tend to be in the fall. And I think, again, it's human psychology. You tend to be more cautious in the fall. I mean, the speculations of summer that seem so brilliant, and suddenly when the chill winds of October come, you wonder if there's such a good idea, and you try to get out. And if too many people do that at once, it causes the market to drop, which causes more people to want to get out, and suddenly, the snowball rolls down the hill.
Hour after hour, the market continued its descent into chaos and pandemonium as stock prices simply collapsed under the torrent of panicked selling. And desperate brokers fought and screamed and trampled one another to get out.
16 million shares traded that day, which seems like nothing today because we trade 16 million shares in the first 5 seconds of the business day. But the trading record set on the day of the crash, the 16 million shares, was not vested until 1969. It was 40 years before the New York Stock Exchange traded more shares than it traded on the day of the crash. The tickers did not stop running until 7:45, when the market had closed at 3:30, I guess.
In the worst single day in the history of the New York Stock Exchange, the market lost $14 billion in value. bringing the week's loss to more than $30 billion, 10 times more than the entire annual budget of the federal government, and far more than the United States had spent during all of World War I. Worst hit in the short run were the thousands of small investors who, believing that everyone could be rich, had bought stock on margin, sometimes borrowing as much as 90% of its book value. In a matter of hours, in some cases minutes, they had lost everything: their life savings, their houses, and their dreams. Financiers who had not been wiped out tried to put a brave face on things, insisting there was no cause for alarm. Prudent investors are now buying stocks in huge quantities, John Jacob Raskob told the New York Times, and will profit handsomely when this hysteria is over.
Wednesday, October 30th, 1929. Mr. Raskob was asked if he believed that the decline in the stock market would have great effects on business. He answered that he did not believe the effects would be other than temporary, lasting probably 2 or 3 months, and that he did not believe that the effects would be drastic in other than luxury industries. The New York Times.
But others feared the worst. The present week, one newspaper editor declared, has witnessed the greatest stock market catastrophe of all times. It would take a decade and a half for the American economy to fully recover.
I think the reason the crash lives on in the American folk memory, although there aren't many people alive today who were adults when the crash happened in almost 70 years ago now, but what followed the crash, the Great Depression, which permanently scarred the American psyche. And we remember the crash as the beginning of the Great Depression, although in fact the two had nothing to do with each other, or very little. But that's why I think the crash became such a benchmark, because it was this very sharp line between the prosperity and the giddy cocktail party of the 1920s and the awful Depression of the 1930s, and the bread lines and the apple sellers and the bonus riots and what have you.
Something very important was said at the end there, and this is something to keep in mind. The stock market crash did not, I repeat, did not cause the depression. It was a symptom of those things which did cause the depression. And we'll take a look at that. One of the things that is going to go all across the country would be what's known as the run on the banks. When things started to go south, then people would go to their banks and demand that their money be taken out. And remember, I started this whole thing by saying if everybody went to the banks, the money's not there. Well, this is exactly what happened. Now remember, banks are an important part of the economy because they lend money out, they hold the money, and they, of course, are and it's an article of faith that you trust your bank. If you don't, there's the word again, trust. If you don't, well, then the system can go. This is a clip taken from a Christmas favorite, which I'm sure many of you will recognize. Let's take a look.
Don't look now, but there's something funny going on over there at the bank, George. I've never really seen one, but that's got all the earmarks of being a run. You got any money in the bank? You better hurry.
George, let's not stop. Let's go.
A minute there. Uh-oh.
Please, let's not stop, George.
I'll be back in a minute, Mary. you? Charlie, what's the matter here? Can't you get in? What is this, Uncle Billy? A holiday?
George.
Come on in, everybody. That's right. Let's come on in. Come on, Jimmy. Now, look, why don't you all sit down? Here, there are a lot of seats over there. Just make yourself at home.
George, can I see you a minute?
Why did you call them?
I just did, but they said you left. This is a pickle, George. This is a pickle.
All right, now what happened? How did it start?
Well, how does a thing like this ever start? All I know is the bank called our loan.
When?
About an hour ago, I handed over all our cash.
All of it?
Every cent of it, and still was less than we owed.
Holy mackerel.
And then I got scared, George, and closed the doors.
The whole town's gone crazy.
Yeah, hello? George, it's Potter.
Hello?
George, there is a rumor around town that you closed your doors. Is that true? Oh, well, I'm very glad to hear that. George, are you all right? Do you need any police?
Police? What for?
Well, mobs get pretty ugly sometimes, you know. George, I am going all out to help in this crisis. I have just guaranteed the bank sufficient funds to meet their needs. They will close up for a week and then reopen.
Just took over the bank.
I may lose a fortune, but I am willing to guarantee your people, too. Just tell them to bring their shares over here, and I will pay 50 cents on the dollar.
Oh, you never miss a trick, do you, Potter? Well, you're going to miss this one.
If you close your doors before 6 p.m., you will never reopen.
George, was it a nice wedding? Gosh, I wanted to be there.
Yeah. You can take this one off now. Now, just remember that this thing isn't as black as it appeared. I have some news for you, folks. I was just talking to old man Potter, and he's guaranteed cash payments to the bank. The bank's going to reopen next week.
But, George, I got my money here. Did he guarantee this place?
Well, no, Charlie, I didn't even ask him. We don't need Potter over here.
And I'll take mine now.
No, but you're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
I got $242 in here, and $242 isn't going to break anybody.
Okay, Tom. All right. Here you are. You sign this. You get your money in 60 days.
60 days?
Well, now, that's what you agreed to when you bought your shares.
Tom, did you get your money?
No.
Well, I did. Old man Potter will pay 50 cents on the dollar for every share you got. Yes, cash.
Well, what do you say?
No, Tom, you have to stick to your original agreement. Now, give us 60 days on this.
Okay, Randall.
Are you going to Potter's?
Better to get half than nothing.
Randall, wait a minute. Now, wait. Now, listen to me. I beg of you not to do this thing. If Potter gets a hold of this building and alone, there'll never be another decent house built in this town. He's already got charge of the bank, he's got the bus line, he got the department stores, and now he's after us. Why? Well, it's very simple. Because we're cutting in on his business, that's why. And because he wants to keep you living in his slums and paying the kind of rent he decides. Joe, you had one of those Potter houses, didn't you? Well, have you forgotten? Have you forgotten what he charged you for that broken-down shack? Here, Ed, you remember last year when things weren't going so well and you couldn't make your payments? Well, you didn't lose your house, did you? You think Potter would have let you keep it? Can't you understand what's happening here? Don't you see what's happening? Potter isn't selling, Potter's buying. And why? Because we're panicky and he's not. That's why. He's picking up some bargain. Now, we can get through this thing all right. We've got to stick together, though. We've got to have faith in each other.
But my husband...
You've got to have faith in each other. So, What eroded that faith? Let's take a look. Number one, people weren't spending. The money was unevenly distributed. Again, if you paid attention to the current election, and how can you ignore it, everybody talks about the middle class, the middle class. Well, you need a strong middle class because it's the middle class that spends. You know, the extremely rich can only have so many cars. They can only have so many houses. They don't need to spend as much. Whereas the consumer is generally the middle class. Well, that middle class was eroding and spending fell. Business inventories up 100% in 1 year. Well, what does that mean? It simply means that businesses were not selling their stuff, so they were keeping their stuff, and then if they don't sell their stuff, then they don't order stuff from the factories, then the factories don't make it. If they don't make it, well, then they don't need all the workers to produce, and again, this becomes a cyclical thing. Take the company And One. No. Take the company Under Armour. Under Armour in China had to close 1,000 stores. 1,000 when all of these problems started with the virus. And I mean, and this again becomes a series of dominoes. 11,000 banks closed in less than a year. And that meant that people's money went with it. So now, if it looks bleak, then that means those who do have money are not going to put their money in banks, or they're not going to loan it out, which means there's no investment. People who own companies are not going to put money back in the company, thereby creating jobs and new opportunities. Instead, they're going to hold on to it. And so, again, what you see is one thing feeding off another. Take a look at this number. In 4 years, our national income dropped over 50%. Over 50%. Now, that's in 1930s money. Today, that would be in the trillions. The gross national product, which is the value of everything that is made in this country, dropped by almost 50% in 4 years. So we were at a standstill, literally going down the economic drain. Now, I want you to take a look at that last figure. That is extremely misleading. 25% of the population without jobs. That only takes into consideration white males. It does not count African Americans. It does not count women. It doesn't count a group that really didn't have this name back then, and that is the teenagers. Other minority groups were not counted. So it was a lot worse than 25%. And then compounding this problem was the problems down on the farm. They had been hit with what later becomes known as the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl took place in Middle America, Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas, where the farmers who during World War I had farmed extensively because of the great market that was in Europe. Well, that disappeared, and so did their farms. They had depleted the soil. They were not used to crop rotation or other scientific methods that are used today to guarantee a livelihood of some type. They were hit with a huge drought, and that just literally blew away their farms. Many of these people were sharecroppers, and that they were the first ones to get blown away by all this. You're going to have a group known as the Okies, people from Oklahoma, who just packed up everything on their cars and trucks and headed towards the promised land, that being California. So, victims of overproduction and inflation. high winds and the loose soil created tsunamis of dust, as you see there, going across the plains.
Beginning in 1930, the arable land of the breadbasket began to suffer a long drought. The drought and poor land management combined to create a vast dust bowl. Refugees from the ruined land fled with whatever remained of their personal belongings. They traveled by whatever means were available, seeking work in other regions of the country. Dust made the day as dark as night, and dust clouds drifted as far as the cities of the East Coast.
By the early 20s, the breadbasket of the nation had begun to suffer the effects of acute neglect. Farms, overplowed in the years of the boom, were devastated by years of withering drought. In the dust storms that followed, topsoil weakened by long overuse was stripped away, leaving 1 million farm families destitute and challenging the faith that the nation's natural wealth is inexhaustible.
There's the area that primarily comprised the Dust Bowl. Farm prices would drop, so much so that some farmers felt the only way to combat that and get themselves out of it would be to destroy their crops. Some farmers were dumping milk in order to push prices up, but none of this really worked, and none of that came to their aid. So what happened to the farmers? And the Dust Bowl just devastated them. As you can see by the pictures, they became poverty-stricken. Caravans of them going out to the West Coast in an attempt to secure some type of land or some type of job, and oftentimes those journeys were fruitless. If you ever get a chance, the movie comes on TV every once in a while, or perhaps you'll read the book, The Grapes of Wrath, an excellent motion picture depicting exactly what happened during this time period. John Steinbeck was the author of that book. Steinbeck was a reporter taking a look at the migrant farmer camps that existed in California, and it led him to write this particular book. So, causes of the Depression: productivity increased, but wages did not. So more stuff is being made, but the ability to buy that stuff did not exist. Decline in investment. People are holding on to their money. The poor distribution of income, as I told you before, the lack of a middle class, the bank failures that we talked about. Many of these companies were holding companies. They existed in pyramid style. So if one of your companies in that pyramid went, then all the other companies would go with it. And again, it was a new style of economy with old style thinking. Try to fight back by raising the tariff. Sound familiar? Exactly, of course, what the current administration is doing. So we raised our tariff wall, not taking stuff from Europe, and they retaliated by doing the exact same thing, which is what China is doing to us now, and therefore we couldn't sell our stuff. In their current situation, farmers in the Midwest now are suffering today because they're not being able to sell to China because of tariff retaliation. Now, why is this depression different from others? Well, it was the most severe one. And there was no opportunities to go west, young man, and we've talked about that before, because there was no more west, so to speak. This was nationwide. We were now a total industrial economy, which means that the repercussions of industries failing were felt nation and economy-wide. And this was a worldwide depression, resulting in what you see there, the shanty towns. This became the anthem during the Depression.
When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower up to the sun, brick and rivet and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell, and I was the kid with the drum. Say, don't you remember, they called me Al. It was Al all the time. Why don't you remember? I'm your pal. Say, buddy, can you spare a dime?
This picture is all taken by the woman who became kind of the photographic chronicler of the Depression, Dorothea Lange. No relation as far as I know. Now, the Hoovervilles. Outside of almost every major American city. Think about the controversy today in Philadelphia when the homeless erected camps. Well, these camps were commonplace, if you will, throughout the United States back during the Depression. So there you are, the unemployment rate. The high was 1933, 25%. It does not go down until World War II. And the architect, the man who gets blamed, perhaps unfairly, for this is Herbert Hoover. Hoover, different individual. Hoover was born poor, went to Stanford to get an engineering degree. Hoover, between classes at Stanford, paid his way through college by selling sandwiches. So he believed in this idea of rugged individualism. The irony is, though he did not want the government to get involved in the economy when the Depression hit, it was he who, after World War I, arranged programs to feed the hungry in Europe and put together a program that saved the new nation, the Soviet Union, aka communism, from collapsing because they had resulted, if you will, to eating dead bodies, cannibalism. And Hoover put that together, but would not do the same for his own country because he did not want them to veer from this path of rugged individualism.
I cannot too strongly urge every voter to go to the polls on election day and cast his ballot in the way that his judgment and his own conscience shall dictate. Whatever the common judgment of the whole of a great people may be, that judgment will be right.
Again, he appears wooden. He appears almost like a puppet. And that was not going to restore the faith or, again, trust.
I cannot too.
He does come up with some policies. The Agricultural Marketing Act, where the government would buy surplus farm goods. But the problem was they bought those goods but did not distribute them to the American people to deal with the hunger problem. The farmers refused to get in line and limit their production. They thought by producing more, they could sell it. And all of this soaked up the excess government revenue that was there that could have helped in some other area.
I am confident that if the Congress could find in these suggestions which come from members of both parties a ground for adjustment of legislation on these dominant particulars and could bring it into immediate action, it would yield not only relief to a sorely distressed people, but would reestablish that confidence which we so sorely need.
Prosperity is just around the corner. That was his motto. Same as the current president saying that we've turned the corner on the pandemic. Well, again, what hole is your head buried in? In both cases. And this was going to weigh on Hoover tremendously. Raise instead of lowering, we raise the tariffs. And again, all right, our overseas trade decreased. So even more inventory was built up as that tariff wall got higher and higher. The Hawley-Smoot tariff was the highest tariff in American history at that point in time. He starts the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Government lent money to banks, but again, it soaked up government revenue because banks continued to close. And instead of using that money to loan it to people, they were using it to pay their own corporate leaders. They were using it to try to, again, buy some cheap stock, which again failed. Many of the people's money was in checking accounts, and those checking accounts, later now this would become illegal, were being used by banks to invest in the stock market. And we all know what happened there. His idea, and it was an idea that was as old as the economy, we're talking about Hoover now, was the trickle-down theory, that if the wealthy and the rich do well, then the benefits will trickle down to those beneath. So most of those programs were designed to provide parachutes for the wealthy and the corporations rather than the American people. The backlash, the bonus army. World War I vets had been promised a bonus of only $100 or so in the 1940s. Well, they wanted it now. So tens of thousands of them marched to Washington, D.C. They wanted to get their payments early. Congress refused. They felt that it was bad government policy to spend money on the economy. So eventually, Hoover ordered the vets driven out. Think about Trump and the famous Bible incident where they order the local National Guard to drive out the protesters around the peaceful protesters from around the White House. Protesters, the bonus army, the vets, were living in a shanty town around the Washington Monument. Eventually, the military goes in there, burns their dwelling. 3 protesters were killed, including a baby, an infant.
Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, 4 troops of cavalry, 6 tanks, and a column of infantry marched on their camp, drove off the veterans and their families with tear gas and bayonets, and burned their shacks.
Douglas MacArthur, a name that will become famous during World War II. One of his subalterns during this march on the bonus army was a tank commander by the name of George Patton. And one of MacArthur's underlings was also a man who becomes famous during World War II, and that'll be Dwight D. Eisenhower, who at this time was a colonel in MacArthur's little army.
1932, Washington was under siege. The capital was surrounded by over 10,000 unemployed veterans of World War I from all over the country. Their only assets were the bonus certificates they'd been given after the war, which promised a cash bonus sometime in the future. They needed it now.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945. What brought you to Washington? Well, to beat the Undertaker, spend the money before the Undertaker gets it.
I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me, this is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism. President Hoover was left to deal with the veterans when the Senate rejected their demands. The marchers had stayed, camped out in central Washington.
It's war. The greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865.
I knew something was going to happen, that they might be attacked. And I had a press card, so I passed the police lines, and then I saw the soldiers advancing into the camp. And when confronted with this, the men all stood there and said, "Stand firm as long as you can." And they started throwing tear gas. I'd never seen anything like it. They systematically went down the line, burned up all the tents and all the possessions of the people there. I was thinking of Herbert Hoover when this happened, because his election was in 3 months. I thought this would be the finish of Hoover.
The orders of the president must be obeyed. And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army. In the shadow of the beautiful dome of the capital of the United States of America.
So it just seemed to people as Americans attacking Americans, peaceful protesters, men who had served in the military, now being totally disrespected.
During the Hoover administration, a Great Depression fell upon the U.S. Factories closed, banks failed, and more than 10 million U.S. workers were out of jobs. As a result, people rallied to the Democrats, electing Franklin D. Roosevelt president in 1932.
No. Who was it that was going to bring this change? What format would this change follow? And how would the nation react to anything that could be that radical? Well, that's something we'll take a look at as we discuss exactly how FDR and the New Deal came to Washington, D.C., and then the world.